Hi, I'm Desi Cerna. Welcome to Guitar Modes, the modal scales of popular music. In this video, you're going to learn everything you need to know in order to understand how modes function in the songs you listen to. You're going to learn that modes are created by roots. You're going to learn that the same patterns that produce the major scale on the fretboard also produce each and every mode. You're going to learn that everything is in a mode, and you've been using them all along. You're going to learn that the parent major scale from which the chords and melody of a song stem is what determines the mode. After you finish this video program, you'll know exactly how to apply modes to music, including your own improvisations and compositions. You'll know the 7 Greek mode names: Ionian, Dorian, Phrygian, Lydian, Mixolydian, Aeolian, and Locrian. With this knowledge, you'll produce new sounds like never before. You may even get goosebumps and fall in love with guitar playing all over again. This information is suitable for intermediate and advanced guitarists, whether you play acoustic or electric guitar. Before you begin, there are a few requirements that are necessary. Number 1, you should already know major scale patterns. And number 2, you should understand chord progressions and playing by numbers. Now, these topics are not taught in this video program, but I have covered them at length in some of my previous work. If you still need to learn major scale patterns, see my book Fretboard Theory, Chapter 5. If you need to learn about chord progressions and playing by numbers, see Fretboard Theory, Chapter 6, or my DVD program entitled Guitar Chord Progressions and Playing by Numbers. The modal concept stems directly from major scales and chord progressions. You absolutely must have a solid working knowledge of these things before you can even begin to understand modes. Failing to understand major scales and chord progressions completely has resulted in a tremendous amount of confusion about modes. All of this confusion can easily be avoided by following the proper steps. You know, when you do things right, you'll not only save yourself the confusion and frustration, but you can literally add years to your playing and development. If you feel your playing meets these requirements, then you're ready to begin. But if you're still sketchy on major scales, chord progressions, and playing by numbers, then take the proper steps to learning these things before you proceed. One more important piece of instruction before we begin. Have you studied modes before? If so, I can guarantee that you've been fed incorrect and misleading information. You need to wipe the slate clean and start over from scratch. Anything that you have previously been taught about modes, throw it out. Forget about it. Never let it enter your mind again. Trust in what I'm telling you, and this will be the last modal lesson you'll ever need. I promise. We're going to begin in the key of G, using the G major scale. And and the chords that are derived from the G major scale. I'm going to start on the 1 chord G. I'm going to play a rhythm track, then I'm going to play the notes of the major scale over the top of the chord, and I want you to listen to the sound that's created. Okay, notice the sound that's created. This is a typical major scale sound. It sounds like do, re, mi when you climb up the scale. Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. It sounds like joy to the world when you descend backward in the scale. Joy to the world, the King has come. Again, it's your typical major scale sound. Now, let's play the 2nd chord in the key of G, A minor, and let's hear what the scale tones sound like when you play them over the 2nd degree. Okay, hopefully you can hear in the 2nd example that the sound of the scale completely changed. When we played the scale over the G chord, it had the typical major sound, but now when we play the scale over the A minor chord, we have a completely different sound. It's got a darker sound, a minor tonality to it, and I like to characterize this as sounding jazzy and minor, like a jazzy minor scale. So the question is, what changed? Because we played the same notes in the same scale over each chord, but they sounded totally different. Well, this is the modal concept. And this concept is exactly like mixing colors. Yellow and blue make green, but red and blue make purple. Both colors, green and purple, have blue in them, but because you mixed them with something else, they produced completely different colors. And the same is true with the major scale. When you play the major scale over a G chord, it produces one sound because your ear hears G as the root and everything seems to revolve around that G. But when you play the same notes over an A minor chord, you change the tonal center of the scale. So now everything appears to revolve around the A. This is the modal concept. In the first example, playing a major scale over its first scale degree, or over its first chord, in our case here, G, produces what's called Ionian mode. Ionian mode. And in the second example, playing a major scale over its second scale degree, or over the second chord in the key, in this case A minor, produces what's called Dorian mode. Dorian mode. There are 7 notes in the major scale. So there are 7 possible roots or possible chords And by the way, when I refer to scale degree, root, or chord, I mean the same thing here in this lesson. So there's 7 possible notes that can function as the root. So the major scale has 7 possible modes. And of course, a long time ago, the Greeks came up with different names so that they could label each one of these sounds that the major scale can create. Before we move on and explore the other modes in the major scale, I want to spend a little bit more time with Ionian and Dorian here. And I want to clear up some misconceptions about what modes are. For example, one of the most common misconceptions is that modes are scales, or that modes are created by changing your starting position in a scale. In other words, if you're playing the notes of G major, you can make this a G Ionian scale by starting on G. Or you could make it an A Dorian scale by starting on A. While technically this is kind of true, if you play G to G, you can call that Ionian. If you play A to A with the same notes, you could call it Dorian. In practice, it doesn't work this way. When you mix the scale over a chord, that's going to produce a modal sound regardless of where you start in that scale. So let's zoom in here and let me give you some examples of what I mean. I'm going to play that rhythm on a G chord again, and then I'll play the major scale over the top. And notice that it does not matter where I start in the scale. I can start on G, I can start on A, I can start on B, and so on. The modal concept is not really affected by where I start in the scale. So notice that the sound of the scale did not change when I changed my starting position, because Ionian mode is created when you play the major scale over its first scale degree, period. It does not matter how you phrase the scale. You can play up the scale, you can play down the scale, you can skip notes, you can repeat notes, you can start on any note, you can end on any note. The modal concept really isn't based on starting positions. It's based on mixing the scale with the chord. Now let's go through and do the same thing over the A minor, and let's see if the Dorian mode sound is affected at all by changing our starting position in the scale. Alright, so here again you can hear that it does not matter where you start in the scale. The modal concept stems from mixing the scale over a root or over a chord. And it doesn't matter how you phrase the scale or what note you start on. So that's the first misconception that I wanted to clear up. The second misconception that I want to clear up is that modes are patterns. Many scale books will teach modes as patterns. In other words, they'll say, here's an Ionian pattern, here's a Dorian pattern, and so on. Well, this is completely untrue. You see, there are only major scale patterns. The major scale notes cover the whole fretboard, and they make one big pattern that covers the whole fretboard. And when you learn the major scale, you have to break this big pattern up into pieces, or up into positions, or smaller patterns. Sometimes you learn it in 5 patterns, sometimes 7. There's many different ways that you can break up the major scale. It really doesn't matter how you break it up, so long as you learn the fretboard and you can piece together the major scale in each position. Now, these pieces on their own are not separate scales. They're simply pieces of the whole major scale pattern. So it doesn't matter what pattern you use. If it's the major scale, it's the major scale. So let's zoom in here and let me go back and play over the G and the A minor, and you'll hear that it does not matter what pattern I use so long as I play the G major scale. Okay, so you can hear that G major scale played over a G chord produces Ionian mode. Not only does it not matter how you phrase the scale or where you start in the scale, it does not matter what pattern, what G major scale pattern you use or what position you're in. It's all G major scale. It's always going to produce Ionian mode. And the same is true if you're playing over the second scale degree, A minor. So let's zoom in and I'll play over A minor, and you can hear that this is true for the A minor as well. Okay, again, so it does not matter what pattern you play in. The G major scale played over an A minor chord will always produce Dorian mode. Doesn't matter how you phrase the scale, doesn't matter what pattern or position you use, because it's all G major. Okay, so let's just review the 2 misconceptions that I cleared up for you. Number 1, modes are not really affected by starting position. Modes are created when you play the scale over a root or over a chord. It does not matter where you start in the scale. And misconception number 2, modes are not patterns. There are only major scale patterns. It doesn't matter what pattern you use. For example, in the key of G, it's all the G major scale. Playing the G major scale over a certain root will produce, that modal sound regardless of what pattern or position that you're in. Notice that in my demonstrations, I actually played the scale over a rhythm track. This is another misconception people have about modes, or at least it's a misunderstanding. They don't realize that modes, to understand the modal concept, you have to play them. You've got to put the scale together with something, a root or a chord. Then you can hear and experience the modal concept. So because of this, as you practice at home, you're going to need to play over a rhythm track too. So I was plugged into a Boss RC20 loop station. This is a great device to have. You can plug your guitar into it and then come out of it, run it into your amp or a PA system or whatever, and then you just stomp on it. It'll record what you're playing, stomp on it again, and it will play back and loop what you played. So it's a great tool for laying down a rhythm track and then keeping that rhythm track going while you play something else over the top of it. If you don't have a loop station, you might have a recording device or perhaps some software on your computer that you can use to record a rhythm track and then play it back and play the scale over the top of it. Also, many keyboards have a function where you can select a drum beat and you can play a basic chord and it will loop that chord and just play it continuously so that you can practice playing over the top of it. If you don't have any of these types of devices, you could always practice with a friend, with another guitar player, and trade back and forth playing the scales and the chord. You could even play with a piano player, and you could even play with a bass player. I like to play over full chords, but the modal concept will still work even if you're just playing over roots. Bass players don't normally play chords. So either way you choose, remember that you need to play the scale over a chord or over a root or over a progression in order to really hear and experience and ultimately understand the modal concept. In order to help you out with playing over rhythm tracks, I did prepare some for each mode for you. Now, a little bit later, after you've gone through and learned each mode, we're going to actually revisit all the modes, and I'm going to give you some more specific examples of some jams and compositions based on these modes. And each one of those sections will end with a scrolling list of songs that are in that particular mode. I give you these songs so that you can go out and look up and learn, or at least listen to, some of these tunes just to better help you grasp this modal concept. And anyway, as those songs are scrolling, behind them is an audio track that corresponds to that particular mode, and you can just practice playing the appropriate major scale right over the top of it. Okay, I still want to do some work with these first two modes that we started with here. And I want to talk about chord progressions. In order to produce an Ionian sound, you don't have to play the G major scale over a G chord alone. You can actually mix G together with other chords in the key. So long as the chord progression is composed in a manner where G sounds like the tonal center of the song, where everything appears to revolve around the G. If you compose your chord progression in that manner, then playing the scale over the top will still produce Ionian mode, even though you may have other chords mixed in, because your ear is still going to hear G as the tonal center of the scale. So let me give you some examples. I'm going to start out with an example that uses G and A minor. Now remember, A minor produced Dorian mode, but I'm going to mix it together with G, and I'm going to compose a progression where G is still functioning as the root. So even though we've got an A minor in there, it will still produce Ionian mode. So notice in this example, we had a G and an A minor chord, but together they still produced Ionian mode because I composed this progression in a manner where G still sounds like the tonal center of the progression, and so it sounded like the tonal center of the scale as well, so it still produced Ionian mode. So remember, you can mix G with any of the other chords in the key. Just be sure to stay in the key of G. All right, we're not switching keys here. We're not adding in something that isn't derived from the major scale. This is why it's so important to understand chord progressions and playing by numbers. So let me give you some other examples of how you can mix G together with other chords but still produce an Ionian mode sound. Now I'll play a progression that will use the major chords in the key of G, G, C, and D, or 1, 4, and 5. Notice that the G note still sounds like the root. Okay, so again, we had G, C, and D in there, 1, 4, 5 progression. C and D on their own would produce different modes, but mixed together here with G in this example, it still produces Ionian mode because you still hear G as the root. Let's move on and let me give you one more example. I'm going to throw in these major chords again plus a minor chord. This G progression will use G, D, E minor, and C. This is 1, 5, 6, 4 in the key of G. Alright, once again, in this example, it still sounds like Ionian mode. I've got other chords mixed in there, but the progression still sounds like it revolves around G, and so does the scale, so it produces Ionian mode. Now let's go to A minor, and let me show you how you do not have to play the G major scale over A minor alone to produce the Dorian sound. You can mix the A minor with other chords in the key of G, so long as you stay in the key of G, and so long as you compose a progression that sounds like it revolves around A. So you've got to compose your progression in a manner where A still sounds like the home base, it sounds like the root. I'm going to play an A minor together with a B minor. This is a 2-3 progression in the key of G. Notice that G still sounds like the root. Okay, so that was a 2-3 progression in the key of G, mixing A minor with B minor. But in this example, the progression still sounds like it revolves around A, so when you play the scale, you still hear A as the tonal center of the scale, and that produces Dorian mode. So you could mix A minor with any chord so long as you are still able to compose the progression in a manner where A sounds like it's functioning as the root. So let me give you another example. Now I'm going to mix A minor with a D major. This is a 2-5 progression in the key of G. Notice that the A still sounds like the root. Let me give you one more Dorian example. You know, you can even put a G chord in together with the A. Now remember, the G chord produced Ionian mode, but I'm going to compose a progression that includes a G, but I'm going to compose it in a manner where you actually hear A as the root, not G, so that this will still produce the Dorian mode sound. There's my A root. All right, so there you have it. We had a progression with G in it, but it still sounded like Dorian mode because that everything was revolving around that A minor chord. So when you played the scale, your ear still hears A as the root. That produces Dorian mode. Okay, we're almost ready to move on and learn the other modes. But before we do, let's have a quick recap. You learned that, like mixing colors, modes are created by mixing the scale with chords or roots. And the modal concept actually stems from physically playing the scale over a root or over the chord. You have to hear them both together in order to hear and experience the modal sound. Modes are not based on starting positions in the major scale. It does not matter what particular scale degree you start playing. The only thing that matters is what you're playing the major scale over. And likewise, modes are not based on patterns. All patterns are simply major scale patterns. And the modal concept is not affected by whatever particular major scale pattern you're using or whatever position you might be in. The modal concept is only affected by how you are playing the major scale over one of its degrees or over one of its chords. And finally, as if I haven't made this clear enough, the modal concept is something you have to physically play. You need to have some sort of device that you can use to record a rhythm track. You need to have something that you can actually play over so that you can hear and experience this modal concept. Okay, so you've learned that the first mode is Ionian. The second mode is called Dorian. The third mode is called Phrygian. Phrygian mode stems from the third degree in the major scale. In the key of G, that would be a B. B is the third scale degree. And the third chord in the G major scale is B minor. If you play the G major scale over a B root or over a B minor chord, you will produce the Phrygian sound. So let's zoom in here and let me give you a little example of what it sounds like. Phrygian mode is characterized as sounding a little exotic, a little Spanish. I like to think of it as kind of an exotic Spanish minor. It is a minor-based sound because it is played over a minor chord. Now I should point out that Phrygian mode is not really used a whole lot in mainstream music. That's why I say it sounds a little exotic. It does occur in Spanish music, or music with a Spanish flavor, although it is usually mixed with other things that are beyond the scope of this video program. But even though Phrygian mode does not occur much in mainstream music, it's still kind of a neat sound, and you can have a lot of fun playing over a B minor chord and just hearing and experiencing that Phrygian mode sound. And of course, you don't have to play over a B minor alone. you can mix the B minor with some other chords in the key of G. Remember, you have to stay in the key of G. You have to select chords that are derived from the G major scale. So let me give you an example of a Phrygian chord progression. I'm going to mix the B minor with a C chord and a D chord. This will be a 3, 4, 5 progression in the key of G. The next mode is called Lydian. Lydian stems from the 4th degree in the major scale. So in this case, we're in the key of G still. The 4th scale degree is C. The 4th chord is C major. When you play the G major scale over a C root or over a C major chord, you will produce the Lydian sound. Let me give you an example of what it sounds like. Lydian mode is pretty uncommon in most mainstream music. It has a very strange and unresolved sound, and this is because of the mode's sharp 4th interval. When you play through the notes of G, starting on C, the 4th note that you play is 1 fret higher than what you'd normally expect a 4th interval to be. And this is because we always expect everything to sound like a major scale. Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. So an F would be a regular 4th interval, but in C Lydian, you don't have an F, you have an F sharp. That's what produces the strange, unresolved sound, really creates a feeling of anticipation or suspense. Because of this, it's difficult to compose Lydian chord progressions because if you move to a different chord, your ear gets drawn away from the C and it kind of settles on the new chord and it hears that new chord as the root. So it kind of destroys the whole modal concept. There still are a couple ways that you can produce Lydian mode with a chord progression. So let me give you an example. I'm going to mix a C major and a D major, and I'm going to show you a little trick that you can do to maintain the Lydian sound. I'm going to play a progression that uses a C chord and a D chord. This will be a 4-5 progression in the key of G. I'm actually going to use open chords. And to help maintain this Lydian sound, I'm actually going to hold the root C while I'm playing the D chord. So I'm actually going to use these other fingers to make that D chord shape. And I'll keep my ring finger on the root C. So I'm going to do this, a C chord, and then a D chord with a C in the bass. That's going to help maintain this Lydian sound by keeping that root C in the bass. It's going to sound like this. The fifth mode is called Mixolydian. Mixolydian mode stems from the fifth degree in a major scale. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. In this case, D. And the fifth chord in a key is major. D major in this case. Let me play the D major chord, and then I'll play the scale over the top of it, and you can hear what Mixolydian sounds like. If you learned about chord construction and adding sevenths to all the chords in the major scale, you know that it is the 5 chord and only the 5 chord that is both major and has a flat 7th interval in it. Together they make what's called a 7th chord. In this case, D7. Now the full name for a 7th chord is actually dominant 7th. So the full name would be D dominant 7th. But for some reason musicians usually call dominant 7th chords simply 7ths, and that still implies a dominant 7th. You know, there are different types of 7ths you can play. You can play major 7 or minor 7. But when somebody says 7, D7, that implies a D dominant 7th, which is a major chord with the flat 7 interval in it. For this reason, Mixolydian mode is also called the dominant scale, or the dominant 7 scale, because it corresponds to the dominant 7th chord, which is the 5th chord in a key. Now, dominant 7th chords are very common in blues music, and because of this, if you're going to play some modal scales over a blues song, it's most likely going to be Mixolydian mode. I will be talking about this later in the video. To produce the Mixolydian sound, you don't have to play over a D chord alone. You can mix the D with other chords as long as you stay in the key of G, and as long as you compose the progression in a manner where D still sounds like the root. Let me give you an example. I'm going to mix a D chord together with C and G. This will be a 5, 4, 1, 4 progression in the key of G, but I'm going to compose this in a manner where D still sounds like the root, so that when I play the scale over the top, your ear still hears D as the root. The sixth mode is called Aeolian. Aeolian mode stems from the 6th degree in the major scale. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. In this case, it's E. And the 6th chord is E minor. Let me give you an example of what Aeolian mode sounds like. Aeolian mode is also called the natural minor scale, or you can simply refer to it as the minor scale. You may have heard people use the term relative major and minor. Maybe you wonder what it means. Well, relative major and minor refers to the first scale degree, Ionian mode, and the sixth scale degree, Aeolian mode. These two modes are the most common of them all. So I think that musicians got so accustomed to either playing in Ionian mode or Aeolian mode that they started to just think about music and categorize it as either major or minor. So to this day, people still use that term. However, it is a little misleading because the other modes in a key are used. They may not be used as much as Ionian and Aeolian, but they certainly occur. And if you really want to understand all the music that you play, you need to understand all of the modes. Anyway, that's what you're learning here in this video program. But I did want to at least mention that in case you wondered what that term relative major and minor meant. In order to produce Aeolian mode, you don't have to play over the E minor alone. You can mix E minor with other chords so long as you stay in key. Let me give you an example. I'm going to mix this E minor with a C and a D. This will be a 6, 4, 5 progression in the key of G. But you'll notice that even though I've got other chords mixed in here, the E will still sound like the root. And when I play the scale over the top, it will still produce Aeolian mode. The seventh and final mode is called Locrian. Locrian mode stems from the seventh degree in a major scale. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. In this case, it's F sharp. The seventh chord is F sharp minor flat 5. Let me give you an example of what Locrian mode sounds like. Okay, sounds very unsettling, doesn't it? Locrian mode is never used. I can't give you one example of a song that uses Locrian mode. I've never, ever played anything that is based on Locrian mode. And the reason is this. The seventh chord, which also is not used, it's when it is used, it's used in a slightly different form. It usually has a seventh in it. But anyway, this seventh chord sounds so unresolved and unsettling that as soon as you move to any other chord in the key, your ear is immediately going to be drawn away from the seventh chord and is just going to rest on that new chord and is going to hear that as the root. So as a result, it's just impossible to create a progression that sounds like it revolves around the seventh chord. The only way you could produce Locrian mode is if you played over the seventh chord alone. And it sounds so strange and unsettling that no one, to my knowledge, to date, has ever made a song based on a minor flat 5 chord. Now you still might have fun jamming over this chord because it it is kind of neat just to hear the strange sound that it makes. One more thing about Locrian mode. You might hear guitar players refer to a type of Locrian mode, and they're actually referring to a mode that is derived from the 7th scale degree of another type of scale, not the major scale. So that's beyond the scope of this video program. And I also want to add that when you start studying that type of stuff, you're really getting into the area of exotic, obscure music. Those types of scales and those types of Locrian modes are not used in mainstream music, mainstream being all of the different styles that you're likely to hear on the radio. Before we move on to the next section, let's review what you've learned. You've learned that modes are created by playing the major scale over one of its scale degrees, or over one of its roots or chords. It doesn't matter where you start at in the scale, doesn't matter what pattern you're using or what position you're in. There are 7 notes in the major scale. Any one of them can function as the root. The Greek names are Ionian, Dorian, Phrygian, Lydian, Mixolydian, Aeolian, and Locrian. Now, in this next section, we're going to go back and revisit each mode, but I'm going to move away from the key of G, and I'm going to give you a handful of examples in various keys. We're going to start with Ionian mode, and then we're going to visit each mode after that. At the end of each modal section will be a scrolling list of songs, and these songs are all going to be in that particular mode that corresponds to that section. And the purpose of this song list is so that you have something that you can go look up and learn on your own. That way you could just better master this modal concept. Also, behind this scrolling list, I've put together a rhythm track so that you can practice playing over. These rhythm tracks correspond to some of the first examples I gave you with each mode, minus my playing over the top, of course. They are all derived from the G major scale, so you can use the G major scale to play over each one of these tracks at the end of each section. We're going to go back now and revisit Ionian mode. I'm going to move away from the key of G. My first example is going to be in the key of C. I'm going to play a chord progression that revolves around C. It's going to use C, F, and G. 1, 4, 5 in the key of C. This progression is in the style of La Bamba by Los Lobos. That's a great example of an Ionian mode song. In fact, I recommend you get a copy of that tune, and you can learn some of the major scale phrases used in that song, or you can just simply let the song play and practice playing the C major scale over the top. The next example is still in the key of C. It's still based on the major chords, although I'm going to be using some distorted power chords instead of the open chords. I'm going to use C, F, and G, and another F. This example sounds very much like All the Small Things by Blink-182. All the Small Things happens to be in the key of C also, and it's based on just the major chords, but throughout the whole tune, each progression still revolves around C. So that song is a great example of the sounds you can make with Ionian mode. Okay, yet another example, still in the key of C. In this example, I'm going to use some more chords. I'm going to throw in some minor chords in here. I'm going to use a C, D minor, E minor, F, and G. So I'm using all 5 of the first 5 chords in the key. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This example sounds very much like the song Fool in the Rain by Led Zeppelin. Fool in the Rain is also based on a progression like this in the key of C, and the guitar solo features the C major scale, and it's a great example of Ionian mode, especially if you're a classic rock fan. So I highly recommend you look up the song Fool in the Rain by Led Zeppelin. Okay, another Ionian mode example, but we're going to switch keys. I'm now going to play in the key of E, in the E major scale. And I'm going to use the chords E, A, C sharp minor, and B. Alright, that was a great Ionian mode jam, and it sounds very much like the song Hit Me With Your Best Shot by Pat Benatar. Hit Me With Your Best Shot is also based in the key of E. It uses a similar progression, and the lead guitar is using the E major scale. Because the E is functioning as the root, it produces the Ionian mode sound. A great solo to look up and learn if you want to learn how to phrase and solo and produce an Ionian mode sound. This is still Ionian mode. I moved back to the key of G here, so we're kind of revisiting the key of G again. And this little jam that I put together is very similar to the song Cliffs of Dover by Eric Johnson. Now there's a lot going on in that song, but the majority of the song is based on chord progressions that revolve around G. And most of the notes that Eric Johnson plays over it are right out of the G major scale, and it's a great example of an Ionian mode sound. Still in the key of G, I'm going to play a progression that uses G and A minor. This is a 1-2 progression in the key of G. I actually did this earlier, but I want to do it again and just play a little bit more over the top. This progression sounds very much like the song Heaven by Los Lonely Boys. Heaven is yet another great example of playing in Ionian mode. If you are able, get a copy of that song and listen to it or play along. That way the sound of Ionian mode can really sink in. Now we're going to revisit Dorian mode. I'm going to give you some additional progressions, and I'm also going to move away from the key of G so that you can play Dorian mode in different keys and different positions. But to start with, I'm going to remain in the key of G. I'm going to play a progression that is based on A minor and B minor. This will be a 2-3 progression in the key of G. I was trying to give this a bit of a jazzy swing because the song Moon Dance by Van Morrison is based on a progression just like this. Now Moon Dance has a couple different sections and actually uses a couple different modes and has key changes in it. But the verses are based on a 2-3 progression in the key of G. Another great modal example that's based on a 2-3 progression is the solo section to Light My Fire by the Doors. I think that they either had their guitars tuned to E flat or perhaps they were playing out of the G flat major scale. But it's actually a similar progression to Moon Dance, and as a result it actually has a similar jazzy kind of sound. A great solo to look up and examine and learn. Also, the song Horse with No Name by America is based on a 2-3 progression. It's not in the key of G, it's actually out of the key of D. But I thought I would mention it. It's a pretty popular song. It is a great Dorian mode example, and it is very similar in its chord structure to Moon Dance and Light My Fire. Okay, new key. I'm now in the key of F. I'm going to use the F major scale. I'm going to play a 2-5 progression in the key of F. This uses the chords G minor and D. The G minor is functioning as the root. It is the second scale degree, so this will produce Dorian mode. Two 5-chord progressions are very common in Dorian mode. This example sounds very much like the song Oye Como Va by Santana. Another one of his hits, Evil Ways, is also in Dorian mode based on a similar 2-5 progression. Those are two really great examples of Dorian mode. I highly recommend that you look up, learn, and play along with those two songs. In this next example, I'm going to be playing out of the key of D flat, and I'm going to be playing a progression that's based on chords 2 and 5. 2 is E flat minor, and 5 is A flat major. And I'm going to play a little riff, kind of a bass line actually, and this little bass line is going to include some blues scale. It's going to include some chromatic passing tones. This is beyond the scope of this video program. I do talk about this in some of my other work. But the chord progression is 2-5, and once I get everything layered here, I'll play over the top, and you're going to hear that it produces Dorian mode. right, well, that was fun. That progression in this particular key sounds very much like the song I Wish by Stevie Wonder. It's based right on this same type of progression in this same key, and it's a great example of a song that is in Dorian mode. Okay, I'm in the key of C now, and I'm actually just going to play something that revolves around a D minor without any chord changes. I'm going to put down a little bass line, then I'll play a little bit of the chord, then I'll play the C major scale over the top, producing Dorian mode. All right, this little example sounds very much like Your Body is a Wonderland by John Mayer, specifically the solo section. Now I want to point out, Your Body is a Wonderland is actually in the key of F, and it's based on the F major scale. During the solo, it moves to D minor, and it stays on D minor. There aren't any chord changes during the solo. Now D minor is in the key of F, so John Mayer could have played the F major scale over the top. That would have produced Aeolian mode, but he didn't. He switched his melody and he switched his scale to the C major scale. That created D Dorian. I love this solo. It's got a really nice kind of jazzy minor sound to it, and it's a great example of playing around the 2 chord, and it's also a good example of how you can have a key change in a song just because one section of a song is based in one key doesn't mean that you can't switch keys and switch modes for another section like a guitar solo or something. Now we're going to revisit Lydian mode. I'm going to give you several examples of playing Lydian mode and some Lydian mode melodies and some Lydian mode progressions, and I'm going to move away from the key of G and give you some examples in other keys as well. To begin with, I just want to give you some sample melodies that are played using that sharp fourth interval that creates the Lydian sound. I'm in the key of G, G major scale, playing off of the fourth scale degree C. Here's the fourth chord, C major. And here is an example of a Lydian melody that's going to use the interval that makes Lydian unique, and that is this sharp fourth interval. Right there. And you can hear a melody like this played right at the beginning to the theme from The Simpsons. The Simpsons. That's a great example of using a Lydian melody. If you just move up a half step and play off of the C sharp here, so now you're actually in the G sharp major scale. Here's your fourth scale degree. You can hear a melody based out of this key using Lydian mode in the song Maria from West Side Story. Maria, I just met a girl named Maria. Take this concept all the way up to the 7th fret and play off of E. So you're actually in the B major scale now. E is the 4th scale degree. And you can hear this used in the theme to the Jetsons. It's got some Lydian melody. In fact, it actually cycles through several different keys, starting in E Lydian, and then F Lydian. Meet George Jetson. F sharp Lydian, his boy Elroy. So The Simpsons, Maria from West Side Story, and the Jetsons are all great examples of familiar melodies that you've probably heard that have that sharp fourth interval in them. They are all based in the Lydian scale or in Lydian mode. Okay, another Lydian example. I'm going to switch keys. I'm going to be playing out of the E major scale this time. And my progression is going to revolve around the 4th scale degree, the A chord. I'm going to use a piece of the A chord. I'm going to use a piece of a B chord, without the root actually. And then I'm going to use another form of A. So I'm going to use A, the 4 chord, B, the 5 chord, and then just another form of A, the 4 chord. This is a cool progression, and I like the way that you can maintain the Lydian mode by kind of pedaling on that A even when you switch chords to B. Really helps. And you can hear a progression like this used in the song Here Comes My Girl by Tom Petty, specifically the intro and the verses. A good example of using Lydian mode. And it's also a good example of how when Lydian mode is used, it's usually only used in sections of a song. For example, in the song Here Comes My Girl, the chorus actually goes to E, And as soon as you hear E, your ear is pulled away from the A and it immediately settles on the E and it hears E as the root. Remember, I mentioned this earlier, it's difficult to produce Lydian progressions sometimes because Lydian sounds unresolved, and when you go to another chord, your ear just gravitates towards that and hears that as the root. So as a result, when Lydian mode is used, it's usually only used in a section, for example, like the verse to Here Comes My Girl, and when other chord changes are introduced, Lydian mode is usually not maintained, and you're really actually in a different mode. Another Lydian example, this is going to be out of the key of C. It's going to use chords 4 and 5, F and G, and the F is going to function as the root. I'm going to play the C major scale over the top, and it's going to produce Lydian mode. This progression sounds very much like the song Dreams by Fleetwood Mac. Dreams is based out of the key of C, using F and G. F is functioning as the root, and you hear the C major scale notes played over the top, producing Lydian mode. Dreams is a great song to look up and learn, and especially to play along with, because aside from one other section, almost the entire tune is based on this progression, and it just keeps repeating and repeating and repeating. So there's plenty of opportunity for you to practice playing the C major scale over the top and produce the Lydian sound. Try it. I'm still in the key of C. I'm going to give you another Lydian mode example, and instead of giving you a chord progression and then playing over the top, I'm just going to do a little riffing and jamming through the scale. Check it out. Okay, so this little example of kind of riffing and jamming through the scale without any chord accompaniment sounds very much like the song Free Will by Rush. That's a great example of composing a song in Lydian mode, specifically the intro and the verses to that song. I believe that other parts of that song change keys and move into different modes. Now we're going to revisit Mixolydian mode. I'm going to give you some more examples in the key of G, and then I'll also move away from the key of G and transpose to new keys. But to begin with, I'm going to give you an example that revolves around a D chord, and I'll be holding a D chord and kind of moving my fingers to grab some scale notes and add melody to it. This example sounds very much like the intro and verses to Norwegian Wood by the Beatles. A great example of using Mixolydian mode. Now that song has some key changes in it. It does switch to different keys and use some different modes, but the intro and the verses are based on Mixolydian mode. Okay, here's a Mixolydian mode example in a new key. I'm going to play in the key of B flat. I'm going to play a 5-4 progression. That would be the chords F and E flat. All right, well that was a lot of fun. I got a little carried away, played a little bit more than I wanted to play. This little example sounds very much like the verses to Tequila by the Champs. Tequila is a chord progression and a melody that almost everybody recognizes, and it is one of the best examples of Mixolydian mode. Now, Tequila does include a chorus which switches to different keys, and it has some key changes in it. But the verses remain in Mixolydian mode. Definitely a song you want to look up, listen to, and either learn or at least just learn how to play along with it. All right, another Mixolydian mode example, this time out of the key of E, using the E major scale. But of course, my progression is going to start on the 5th degree, B. I'm going to mix it with an A chord, which is the 4th in the key of E. So your ear's going to hear B functioning as the root. When I play the scale over the top, it's going to sound like Mixolydian mode. This is an example for all you hippies out there, as the Grateful Dead version of Fire on the Mountain is based on this type of progression right in this key. In fact, Fire on the Mountain is an excellent example of using Mixolydian mode. And what I love best about that song is that there are no other changes. It just continues using the same progression, B to A, which is a 5/4 progression in the key of E. It uses it through the entire song. There are no other parts. You can turn that song on, just let it play, practice playing your E major scale over the top, and produce Mixolydian mode the whole time. Try it. All right, another Mixolydian mode example. This is going to be out of the key of D. But of course, I'm going to use the 5th scale degree, A, and I'm going to mix it together with a G chord, which is the 4th scale degree. But the 5th scale degree A is going to function as the root, and when I play over the top, it's going to produce Mixolydian mode. You know, you can hear a progression just like this used in the song On Broadway by George Benson. It's a great example of Mixolydian mode. I know that that song has key changes in it, but most of those key changes are just changes to Mixolydian mode in another key. So the root chord in each of those sections is still based on the 5th interval, producing Mixolydian mode. Another Mixolydian mode example, now I'm going to play in the key of A. I'll be using the A major scale. But of course I'm going to be playing off of the 5th scale degree E, using an E major chord. And I'm also going to use the 4th chord in the key of A, D. All right, this example sounds very much like the song No Rain by Blind Melon. A great example of Mixolydian mode. It's got a really nice Mixolydian melody in there, and then you can hear some Mixolydian lead guitar work later. There are a couple other things mixed into that song, but most of the song is based on Mixolydian mode. You can actually ignore some of the other things, play the A major scale over that entire song, and pretty much produce Mixolydian mode the whole time. Here's another Mixolydian example in the same key as the last, also using an E and a D. But I'm going to do something a little bit different. Rather than playing vertically up and down scale patterns in different positions, I'm going to play horizontally. I'm going to play the A major scale on the G string alone. Check it out. that was fun. If you've never tried playing through scales horizontally like that, you definitely want to give it a try. It's kind of neat how you can bend and slide and move around and just stay on one string. You might have to take some time to kind of memorize the pattern because you're probably used to playing vertically up and down patterns in each position. So this is kind of a new concept. Anyway, you can hear this concept used in the song I'm So Glad by Cream. It features Eric Clapton. It's in the same key, and the bass is basically playing around a progression based on E and D. And then Clapton, rather than using his trademark pentatonic boxes, actually used a modal scale. He played the A major scale, producing Mixolydian mode, and he stayed on the G string and just moved around on the G string using this horizontal scale movement concept. All right, another Mixolydian example, and I'm still in the key of A. So I'll be using the notes of the A major scale, but of course E is going to be the root, and instead of playing over chord changes, I'm going to play this over a little bass line based on the scale too. Okay, so notice that again I was using some horizontal scale movement, and I also had my pinky trailing the whole time. I was duplicating the notes. I was playing octaves. You can hear this done in the song Third Stone from the Sun by Jimi Hendrix. Now, Third Stone from the Sun has several sections in it and key changes with different modes, but the main melody in that song, the melody that sounds similar to what I was playing, is based out of the key of A, revolving around the 5th scale degree E, producing the Mixolydian mode. Now we're going to go back and revisit Aeolian mode, and I'm going to move away from the key of G that you first learned it in, and I'll give you some examples of playing Aeolian mode in various keys. To begin with, we're going to play in the key of C. We'll be playing off of the 6th scale degree A, an A minor chord, and it'll go like this. Okay, that little jam there sounds very similar to Maria Maria by Santana. That's a great example of an Aeolian mode song. During the parts where the guitar melody is most prominent, there's no chord changes. It's just the C major scale played over an A minor chord. But later in the verses, there are some chord changes. There's a D minor and an E minor. They all still stay in the key of C. And really, the whole song is Aeolian mode. You could actually just practice playing over the whole tune, and it will produce Aeolian mode the whole time. Still in the key of C for this next Aeolian mode example. This example resembles one of the most famous guitar solos of all time from one of the most famous songs of all time. The guitar solo in Stairway to Heaven by Led Zeppelin is based right out of the key of C, revolving around the 6th chord, A minor, and it produces Aeolian mode. Still in the key of C for this next Aeolian mode example. This time, instead of playing single note lines, I'm actually going to harmonize and play some thirds. And some fifths too. All right, this little example was based on an A minor chord and an F. I wasn't fretting the whole chords because I was moving around and playing some melody using thirds and fifths. And this little example sounds very much like Rhiannon by Fleetwood Mac. That the intro and the verses to that song, the first part of the verses at least, are right out of the C major scale, using A minor as the root, producing Aeolian mode. Okay, here's a new Aeolian mode example. This is in the key of E, E major scale. But I'll be playing off the 6th degree C sharp minor. So you'd really call this C sharp Aeolian. And I'm going to use a little bit of the 5 chord B and a little bit of the 4 chord A. All right, this example sounds just like the Jimi Hendrix version of All Along the Watchtower. I believe that he played his version in this same position, but I think his guitar was tuned to E flat, so if you try to play along with the recording, you'll notice that you either need to tune your guitar to E flat, or you could just move everything down a fret. Instead of playing the E major scale, play the E flat major scale over the top, and it should mix right in, and it will produce the Aeolian mode sound. All Along the Watchtower is great because there are no other progressions, there are no other sections. The entire song is based on this same progression. It's always revolving around the 6th, and it's always producing Aeolian mode. So you can just put that song on and just let it play, and you can play Aeolian mode all the way through, beginning to end. We'll be in the key of G for this next Aeolian example. So back to G, and it's going to revolve around, of course, the 6th, which is E, E minor. I'm going to mix in a little bit of the 5 chord D, and a little bit of the 4 chord C, but everything will sound like it's revolving around E. E is the root in this whole progression. I'll play the G major scale over the top, and it's going to produce Aeolian mode. This little example is very similar to the song Nothing Else Matters by Metallica. Now that song has some other elements mixed in with it, but the majority of that song is based on notes for the G major scale, specifically revolving around the 6th scale degree E, producing Aeolian mode. I'll be in the key of F for this next Aeolian mode example, using the notes from the F major scale and chords derived from it. I'll be focusing on the 6th scale degree D, D minor. I'm going to mix it together with the 3rd scale, the 3rd chord in the key A minor. I'm also going to mix in the 2nd chord in the key G minor. But D really remains the root the whole time. It's kind of the tonal center of the whole progression. Everything starts and comes back to D minor. So when I play the F major scale over the top, it's going to produce D Aeolian mode. This example here sounds very much like Black Magic Woman by Santana. That song also stems from the F major scale, and the progression revolves around the 6th scale degree D and a D minor chord. And of course that song includes some melody that's very similar to what I was playing as well. A great example of Aeolian mode, and most of the verses and choruses and guitar solos remain in this mode, so you can play through most of that song. All right, now I'm switching to the key of D, the D major scale. And of course we'll be focusing on the 6th scale degree B, B minor. And I'm going to mix this together with the 2nd chord in the key, E minor, the 3rd chord in the key, F sharp minor, and the 4th chord in the key, G. Alright, this progression was a little bit longer than some of my other examples. And it sounds very much like the song "The Thrill Is Gone" by B.B. King. "Thrill Is Gone," I believe, is based out of the key of D. And it's in Aeolian mode, meaning that everything revolves around the 6th scale degree B and B minor. This is a good example of a blues song which really doesn't have any blues elements in it. It's actually, strictly, the chord progression is strictly diatonic to the major scale. I mean, it stems right from the major scale. There's no key changes. As you'll learn later, most blues songs are based on dominant 7th chords, and most blues songs are a series of key changes. All right, new key for this next Aeolian mode example. This is going to stem from the A flat major scale. But this progression, which is just going to use power chords, not full bar chords, is composed in a manner that you hear the 6th degree F functioning as the root. This is a good example of playing a progression without full chords. I was just using power chords, but of course the intervals were still derived from the A flat major scale, and I played the A flat major scale over the top, and because the 6th scale degree F was functioning as the root, it produced Aeolian mode. And you can hear a sound like this used in the song "Smells Like Teen Spirit" by Nirvana. The 7th mode is Locrian mode. We will not be revisiting this because, of course, Locrian mode is not used. Maybe you could be the first person to, compose a hit song with Locrian mode. I doubt it, but you might have fun trying anyway. Earlier I mentioned that blues music can use modes too, and it usually uses Mixolydian mode. This is because Mixolydian mode, aka the dominant 7th scale, goes together with dominant 7th chords. And most blues songs revolve around dominant 7th chords. If you're ever playing a dominant 7th chord, then that chord is the 5th of its parent major scale, because only the 5th chord in a key is both major and has a flat 7 interval, which produces a dominant 7th chord. For example, the other major chords in a key, 1 and 4, have a major 7 interval in them. They produce major 7th chords. They don't produce a dominant 7th chord. Dominant 7ths are used a lot in blues, and blues players will usually just use, pentatonic. A lot of minor pentatonic, some of the major pentatonic, a combination of the two. I talked about this at length in my book Fretboard Theory and also in my pentatonic DVD, so I'm not going to get into that again. But one thing I didn't mention, which is appropriate now, is that sometimes modal scales are used. So for example, if you're playing over an A7 chord, A7 is the 5th of the D major scale. You kind of have to count backwards, or you actually can just use the chord patterns that I teach in my book and my chord progression DVD. So a 7th chord is always the 5th. So if you're playing A7, the correct parent major scale to play over the top is the D major scale. So this would make A Mixolydian mode. Let me give you an example of playing around an A7 chord, and I'll play a little bass line using the notes of D major, or A Mixolydian mode. I'll put a little 7th chord in there, and then I'll just kind of play around with some scale work. It's all going to be D major scale, because the 5th scale degree A is functioning as the root. It's going to sound like A Mixolydian mode. Well, if you're a blues player, this might be a brand new concept to you, and it might finally explain some of the melodies and runs that you're used to hearing in blues songs that wouldn't fit into the pentatonic, and you probably wondered, gosh, where the heck did these notes come from? How did they know that they could do something like that? Again, a lot of blues players will play primarily pentatonic, but you do hear Mixolydian mode come up from time to time, especially over the 7th chords. Now I want to explain something. Blues songs are usually based on what appears to be a 1-4-5 chord progression. So for example, if you were in a key of A, 1-4-5 would be A, D, and E. But usually a blues song is based on 3 dominant 7th chords, or some type of dominant 7th chord, like a 9th chord. So the actual chord changes are A7, D7, and E7. Or maybe an A9, which is an A7 chord with a 9th added to it, D9, and E9. A 7th, anything with a dominant 7th in it, that's a major bass chord like an A7 or an A9, must be a 5 chord, because only a 5 chord in the major scale is major and has the flat 7th interval necessary to produce a 7th chord. So what that means is, if you're playing over a song that uses A7, D7, and E7, the A7, the appropriate parent major scale to play over the A7 is the D major scale, because A is the 5th of D. But when the song switches to the D7th chord, this is a key change. D7 is the 5th of G. So you have to play the notes of G over the D7. And the E7 is the 5th of the A major scale. So you have to play A major scale over the E7. So you can see that if you're going to apply modal scales over a blues song that uses 7ths, then each chord is actually a key change, and you'll have to switch keys to correspond to each chord. This can get really hard to follow, especially with good players that know their scales all over the fretboard, and they're able to easily switch keys, so they can be all over the place. You will hear this occur in blues music a little bit, so it's good to kind of get introduced to this concept, and you can experiment more with it on your own. But I should mention that you will probably hear this used even more in styles like jazz and country, because most blues players don't really play over the chords. They don't really follow the chord changes. They usually will stick in pentatonic boxes and apply the same scale pattern over the whole progression, which is fine. It works and it does sound good. But country players and jazz players seem to like to follow the chords more closely, so they're more likely to use the modal scales and play over it as if it were all key changes. And not only can it get complex because you've got 3 different keys and 3 different major scales to correspond to the chords, but also jazz players and country players like to put in chromatic passing tones to kind of bridge the gap from the key changes, which ends up creating some really, really neat lines. But to a player that isn't all that experienced, both in playing that style of music and also in the theory behind it, it can be really, really hard to follow. In this final section, I'm going to clear up one more misconception about modes, and then I'm going to give you some examples of how you can create your own modes in your own improvisations and compositions. Now, another big misconception about modes is that you can impose modal sounds over the top of songs or progressions. Well, the modal concept doesn't work this way. Let me explain. If a song's chords and melody are derived from the G major scale and everything is revolving around the G major scale, that's going to produce G Ionian mode. There's nothing you can do to change the modal sound. If you play the G major scale over the top, but you begin on a different scale interval, it's still going to produce Ionian mode because G is still functioning as the root. If you try to play modal scales from other keys, then you're just going to sound out of tune. So if a song is in Ionian mode, there's nothing you can do to change it. This is why it's so important to understand major scales and chord progressions. Because with the modal concept, you don't impose sounds over a song. You simply recognize what the song is. You recognize what the mode is, and then you follow it. Get it? There's a big difference here. And unfortunately, many people are taught modes backward, and they think that the modal sound is created on something that you impose on a song. Not so. Okay, so as you play modal scales and you produce modal sounds, you will simply be identifying the parent major scale from which a song's chords and melodies stem, and then you'll be playing that same major scale over the top, following the mode, not imposing the mode on the song. Well, what if you do want to have control over the modal sound? How can you do it? Well, you have to start from scratch. If you're composing your own tracks, then you can choose the progression and the melody, and you can choose the mode. So, for example, let's say you're going to make up your own jam, right? Well, you got to start with a chord or a chord progression. If you start with a major chord, for example, let's say G. Remember, there's three major chords in a key: 1, 4, and 5. If this G is the 1 chord, and you play the G major scale, you'll produce G Ionian mode. But this G could be the 4 chord, and that would produce G Lydian mode. Or this G could be the 5 chord, and that could produce G Mixolydian mode. So, let me give you an example here. I'm just going to play some rhythm on G. So I can play the G major scale over the top and produce Ionian mode. But since there are no other chord changes in this song, this G chord could just as easily fit into, for example, the key of D, which means it would be the 4th chord. This would produce G Lydian mode. So I'm going to play the same G rhythm. I'm going to play the D major scale over the top, producing G Lydian mode. Alright, this G chord can fit into the key of G, it can fit into the key of D, and it could just as easily fit into the key of C. If it were in the key of C, it would be the 5 chord. So I can play the C major scale over this, and I will produce G Mixolydian mode. So you can see if you're only dealing with one chord and there's no other notes or no other melody or anything else that is determining what the parent major scale is, then you can choose whether or not it's the 1 chord, the 4 chord, or the 5 chord. You can choose to make it either Ionian mode, Lydian mode, or Mixolydian mode. Likewise, you could also choose to produce a progression that revolves around the chord. So for example, if I want to do a Ionian mode progression that revolves around G? Well, I got to use chords from the key of G. This is a 1-4-5-4 progression in the key of G. All these chords are derived together, combined, from the G major scale. So I'll play the G major scale over the top. And it produces G Ionian mode. Now I can make this a Lydian progression if I consider the G to be the 4 chord in the key of D, and I mix it with chords in the key of D. So I'm going to play G and A together. This would be a 4-5 progression in the key of D, because only the D major scale can produce a G major and an A major together. So then I'll play the D major scale over the top, and I'll produce Lydian mode. All right, now I could consider the G chord to be the 5th from the key of C, and I can mix it together with chords in the key of C. So for example, I'm going to play G, F, and C. These 3 chords combined only occur in the C major scale. I'll play the C scale over the top, and you'll hear Mixolydian mode. Anyway, I think you get the idea. So if you're involved in the writing process from the beginning, then you can choose the mode, because you can determine what parent major scale you're going to use, and what scale the chords and the melody are going to be derived from. Let me give you one more example of a little jam you could put together for yourself and practice playing modes. Let's say that you were playing with a bass player or another musician, and they were simply playing an E. So that's all you've got is an E root. Well, so you know that whatever you play over the top of it, E is going to be the root. However, is it an E major or is it an E minor? Well, you could make it either or. It's whatever you want. You could mix in an E major chord, right? Now, if you're going to treat this E root as an E major chord, are you going to consider it to be the 1 chord, the 4 chord, or the 5 chord? Since there's nothing else going on, there's nothing to determine what the mode is, you can decide. So this is what it sounds like as the 1 chord. This will produce Ionian mode. And you can experiment with this more on your own. Now remember, this E could just as easily be the 4 chord. E is the 4 chord in the key of B. So I can play B major scale over this, and I'll produce the Lydian sound. Let's keep going. I could consider this E root to be an E major, specifically the 5 chord from the key of A. So I could play the A major scale over this E root, and it would produce E Mixolydian mode. You get the idea. Now, remember, this E root doesn't have to be a major chord. It could be a minor chord. Now, if it's a minor chord, which minor chord is it? Is it 2, 3, or 6? Well, since there's no other melody or no chords, we're just simply playing over an E root by itself. That means that the possibility is wide open. You can make it whatever you want. So if you want it to be the 2 chord, you can play the D major scale. E minor is the 2nd chord in the D major scale. And if you play the D major scale over the top, you'll produce Dorian mode. All right, instead of being the 2 chord, you could play an E minor that is the 3 chord. E minor is the 3 chord in the key of C. So I can play the C major scale over this E root. That would produce E Phrygian mode. Or this E could be the 6th chord. E minor is the 6th chord in the key of G. So if I play the G major scale over this E root, it'll produce E Aeolian mode. So this is kind of a fun little example that you could probably do on your own, especially if you have some type of recording device where you can just let one single note play. This way, you not only can choose the chord, if it's major or minor, but you can also choose which major and minor chord it is from the key, and you can actually experiment with producing all the different modes based on that one root. Try it. This concludes Guitar Modes, the modal scales of popular music. Hopefully, now that you've finished this video program, you'll no longer be held up by incorrect and misleading information about modes. Now you know how to examine a song and identify the mode. This way you can identify the correct parent major scale to play over the song, and you can produce appropriate sounds. For many guitar players, this completely opens up their playing because they never really knew how to identify a song's mode. They never really knew how to identify the correct major scale to play over a song. Well, now you can. And doing so might just give you goosebumps. You might fall in love with playing all over again. If you're a creative person and you like to compose your own improvisations and compositions, well then understanding modes is just invaluable information. Because now, from the very beginning, you can control the sound or the mood of a song by choosing which major scale degree your song or your jam is going to revolve around. If you want something that's going to kind of sound dark, well, you can choose one of the minor modes. If you want it to sound jazzy, choose Dorian. Compose a song that revolves around the 2 chord in a key. If you want it to sound exotic and have a bit of a Spanish flavor to it, then compose your song around a 3 chord in a key, and so on. If you want your song to sound happy and have major chord quality to it, then you can compose around one of the 3 major chords. If you want it to sound just like your typical normal major scale, then compose around the 1 chord, Ionian mode. If you want it to sound strange and unresolved, if you want to create a feeling of anticipation or suspense, well, then you can compose your song around the 4 chord Lydian mode, and so on. Well, thanks for watching. I'm Desi Cerna. If you'd like to learn more about me, including my books, DVD programs, and all the free content I have posted around the internet, just Google search my name, Desi Cerna. That's D-E-S-I-S-E-R-N-A. Or you can visit my website at guitar-music-theory.com. That's guitar-music-theory.com. If you have any questions or comments, please send them to me. You can email me directly from my website. I read all of my email and I respond to all questions. If you email me, you may get an automatic reply asking you to verify yourself. If you do, just follow the steps to verifying yourself, and then your message will be delivered to me. I'm going to end this video program with the same music I used to begin it. But let me tell you a little bit about it. I composed a track that uses the E major scale, but with everything revolving around the 4th scale degree, A. This produces A Lydian mode. And the track I produced actually is just droning in A, and there's a little bit of melody played by a bass instrument that is using the notes of the E major scale. And then I play the E major scale over the top. Now remember that Lydian mode sounds kind of strange. It has a feeling of anxiety, suspense, anticipation. And I added to this by using a volume pedal and swelling into a lot of the notes. Also, I added some extra fun things to the track. I've got some percussion instruments and different sounds just to make it sound more interesting, including the sound of wind. A little interesting note, I actually composed this track for a performance I did years ago here at a local college in my home state of Ohio. It was in the middle of January, it was very windy, and it was frigid cold. So I added those elements in just to kind of mimic the weather around. I used this track to start the show, creating that suspense, creating that anticipation, and then of course I went into other things from there. So thanks again for watching, and here's some Lydian mode for you.